Hi there. In this, my first Blender 2.8 beta tutorial, I'm going to cover how to create something like this scene. So you can see we appear to be flying through a cityscape. There's some sort of fog or something obscuring the ground, and we're flying around it, and obviously we've got an assortment of different buildings. So it's a relatively simple scene really, but there's quite a bit created in there just to keep the eye busy. And I'll also cover how to animate the camera through the scene like this as well. So the first thing to note is that I did this with Eevee. I specifically did that with Eevee. It means it's not quite as accurate as cycles would be, but obviously it renders much more quickly, and I can demonstrate that now. So here is the scene that I created, and we're in Eevee shader mode at the moment. And if I press play on the timeline, so this is not a video loaded, this is the actual scene. I can actually move the camera around and you can see there it is. And if I press play down here, you can see we start to move straight away. It's not perfect, the frame rate's pausing a little bit, and obviously I've got a video recorder going on at the same time. But you can see we're getting a pretty good impression of what the final scene will look like. You notice if I stop, there's some changes happen to certain things, especially to the fog. And that's obviously because it gets a little bit more time to render that at a slightly higher quality. And it is slightly different again when you actually formally render. So let's start a new scene and create this from scratch. So to begin with, I'm just going to add a simple plane. And we'll scale that up. The scene I create during the tutorial will be slightly simpler than the one I created for the demonstration, just for time reasons. Make sure your overlays are switched on up here. If they're switched off, you'll find it a lot more difficult. And also, let's make sure while we're thinking about it that we are in Eevee mode, because that's what we want to render this one in. Obviously, Eevee will allow us to render an animation much more quickly. So we'll go into edit mode, just press tab on there. We'll look from above and we'll subdivide. In Blender 2.7.9, you could just press W. That doesn't seem to work in Blender 2.8 at the moment. Hopefully that'll be reinstated when it's finally released. But at the moment, you need to go to Edge, Subdivide. The little menu will often come up minimized like this. You just need to open that and then just increase the number of subdivisions. So 10 is probably not enough. I'm going to go for 25. And that's just to give us a nice matrix. So at this point, looking down at the mesh from above, I'm going to press U and select project from view bound. So that's just unwrapped it. Doesn't matter too much depending on whether you're going to apply much for texture. I'm not going to. Press A twice quickly or Alt A and then go to face select, which is here. And then we'll select box. You can do that with B, and we'll start to create some roads. So this is our city surface, and we can have, for example, a thin road like that. I'm just pressing B again to make some more selections. Or we can perhaps have a thicker road that comes all the way down there, perhaps one that goes all the way across. And the idea of this is that this is areas where there won't be any buildings. And obviously you need that. You need spaces between the buildings, if only to drive your cars. And that will do for now. So we'll come over to here and we'll select vertex groups, and we'll create a new vertex group, and we'll just assign to that. We could invert the selection, but this is fine at the moment. So if I press A quickly again and then click select over here, you can see we've got our roads defined. If you want to, you can also apply materials that are different for the road and so on. But for me, I just set it up so that you couldn't really see the road. My thinking was what a city looks like when you fly into it, and you really don't see a lot of detail except where there are lamps or lights. So at this point, let's put a basic material on there. So I'll say new, make sure it's using nodes. It's defaulted to principled shader. We can quickly go to shading, and you can see there's our material, and we get sample reflections and things like that. And there's our basic material there. Don't need this too much at the moment. And we've got a basic principled shader. So I just left most of it at default, but I set the base color quite dark. I didn't change anything else other than the base color. So it's just a dark color. I'm not really looking for an awful lot from this surface. We'll change the name of this collection to main, just so that we know which one we're looking at. So collections are like layers, and this scene is currently being built in what's now called the main layer. You can see I've got a secondary layer there which has got the camera in it. That's just to do with my default setup. So let's put a lamp in the scene. So we'll add a light, and we'll make this a point light. And there it is. Now, to help guide me with things like the light, I actually did change the material slightly. So if I go back into edit mode, remember it's left click to select things. We'll call that base city material, and then I'll add a new material. We'll just copy the base city material, but click this little 2 to make it unique. Have to do that out of edit mode. Road, we'll call that. For both these materials, we'll assign that to the road. But if we come to viewport display, we can make the road more visible, perhaps by making it darker like that. So now we can easily see where the road is, which is useful when we're editing something that we want to position relative to the road. So I didn't put an awful lot on, but you could, for example, position a lamp, something like that. And I'm in orthographic, by the way, so there's no parallax in this view. And then I can perhaps just put some lights, probably way too few really. And I'm just duplicating them and saying G, Y, and I know you can just repeat this, and we'll leave that there for now. But we've got 4 lamps there at default settings that will just give us a bit of illumination. If I quickly press this over here, this shading option, you can see there's our lamps shining down on our ground. I've just lifted the ground up a little bit above the grid so that we can see it better. So next we need to go and make some buildings. So in earlier versions of Blender, I'd have just gone to a nice clear separate layer. It's not quite as straightforward in the beta version of Blender 2.8. I need to come over here. So I'll just put my 3D cursor there, and I'm going to add a simple mesh cube. Absolute size doesn't matter too much, but I'll make it big enough so that I can see it, and scale on the Z. And now press dot to focus on it. We've gone into perspective mode, so I'll just come out of that. Now you notice not only is our 3D cursor there, but our origin point is as well. So let's just move the 3D cursor away. Press tab to go into edit mode, G, Z, and let's just lift this up so that the origin point, that little orange dot, is perhaps just above the very base of our building. So we now need to define some edges so that we can unwrap this. You don't have to do that. You could just UV unwrap each face separately, but it's a lot easier to do it this way. So we'll go to edge select, and we'll select an edge, press Ctrl E and say mark seam. I'm not going to worry about the top and bottom of my building too much. In fact, I'm ultimately going to remove the bottom of the building so that we don't even have a face there. So thinking about how this would unwrap like a box. At the moment, it's all joined together by that top. So I need to select with Shift held down 3 of those top faces, and then Ctrl E again and mark seam. So that means those 2 parts will stay together, as it were, but this top will come away from these other faces, and this seam down here will open up, and that should allow us to make this flat once I've removed this bottom face. So I'll go to face select, press X, and say faces. So we haven't got a bottom face now. So in theory, that should now UV unwrap quite well. And you can see it's actually already doing so. But let's just make sure it's unwrapped properly. There we go. So some nice coherent faces there, which is fine. I'll actually want a different material for the top, but that doesn't matter. Let's put a basic material on our building. So we'll come down to materials and say new, and we'll call this building base. And again, just a very simple material. You get the principled shader by default with 2.8 and a relatively dark color and everything else at default. So pretty much the same shading setup as the ground. Doesn't need to be, of course, but this is just what I selected. So selecting the object settings, we'll call this building, but we now need to apply another material to it. So let's click plus, say new. I'm going to add a texture, which is an image texture. I'm going to go to my textures, and you see I've got a number of textures in here. All I've done is I've taken some images of city buildings. Some of them I think have come from CG Textures, and some of them I've just acquired myself, and then basically tiled them to make them work, roughly speaking, as a tile, at least a horizontal tile. And I've got 3 different versions of it with more and less lights on them. So let's select this one, and then we'll just connect that initially straight in. I now need to define where that texture is going to be used, so I'm just going to use it on obviously these faces. We'll call this City Lights 1 and assign it. We can immediately see there's a bit of a problem there. They're the wrong way round, but that's easily corrected. We go to UV editing. We can call up the City Lights texture there, and clearly these faces are round the wrong way, and they probably are stretched as well. So we'll select these faces. These are the faces around the outside here, and rotate 90. And if we go to material view, you can see what that's looking like here. So you can see that's way too zoomed in. And then I'm going to scale it on the Y. And you can see we get a more reasonable number of lights. That may actually be upside down, so we'll just rotate that 180 like that. So you can see that's our basic textures there. However, just a material like that is not emitting light. So in the dark, that won't really show anything unless there's a light shining on it, which isn't what we want. So if I go to the world now, and we'll set this to quite a dark color for now, and then we'll go to Eevee. Sometimes you need to sort of come out and go back in to get it to recognize that you've changed something. So you can see, because there's no actual lamp really shining on it, it's getting a little bit of illumination from the sky. That's obviously not working. So we need to do a little bit more with this shader. So I'll add a shader which is an emission shader, and I'll feed this into the emission shader, and I could just take that straight to the surface. So I'm not even using the principled shader, and that starts to work. The only thing I'd say is though, if I have some different material, perhaps a more reflective material for the base of the building, that won't show where there is no shining light. So it might be that I want the areas between the windows to show up more when there's light to reflect off them. So I might want to put in, for example, if I take that away from there, I'll add a shader which is a mix shader and drop that there. Put the basic building material on the other side, then add a converter which is a color ramp. Take the output from my city lights texture into that, and just to see what I'm doing, I'm just going to feed that into the emission shader, and obviously it'll go black and white up here, and then trim this in so that we've really just got wherever there's lights actually shining, we'll get white, but other than that it'll be black. So feed my texture back into there, and then use this color ramp to control the mix on that mix shader. And you can see it's the wrong way around at the moment, so the simple thing to do is just to flip it. We can then play with this a little bit just so that we can control how much is coming through. Perhaps use B-spline just to make it a little less extreme. And there we are. So where there is no light shining through, it defaults to the basic building material that we have set up. So it looks more coherent and as though it's part of the building. You could even add some bump effects as well if you wanted the windows to stand out slightly. So that's our basic building created. I'm just setting the basic building color a little darker. So obviously we need some duplicates of that now. But before I do that, I'm actually going to add another material. We'll just say new, and we'll say flashing light. I had some problems with this material, but I'll come to that as we develop it. So we'll make this a viewport color of orangey red. So I'm going to duplicate that building and just take it over there. Now this time I think I'll make this a wide building. You don't have to worry too much about making large and small buildings because that's going to be taken care of the overall size by the particle system, or it can be, it doesn't have to be. But you do want to make varying proportions of buildings. So that's quite a wide building. And this time I'm going to alter the top of the building. So perhaps we'll select that top face, E to extrude, G, Z, and then scale that in. And then perhaps E to extrude again, G, Z, E to extrude again, and scale that in. I think perhaps we'll scale all of that in except on the Z, and then G, Z just to move that top down a little bit. So we've got a sort of needle on the top of that building. So making a generally fatter building now. But I probably want most of my buildings to be about this sort of proportion. Now if you want more of a particular shape of building than another, given we're going to use a particle system, just create more copies of them. Whereas I probably want fewest of this type of building. I will make that one slightly bigger, which will mean it will tend to be a larger building anyway, which is fine, but doesn't mean it can't be smaller than these, so bear that in mind. So I'll just make a duplicate of that and put all those there. So we've now got all our buildings. There will be an issue with the unwrapping on this one. If we go to here, you can see the top face there hasn't been unwrapped properly because I changed the shape of it. The unwrapping on these should be okay. I'm not going to worry about that right now. So I'm going to select all of these buildings now and say move to new collection, and we'll call it buildings. And that's quite important. And we'll just move them over here a little bit. So you can see we've got a collection down here called buildings with all the various different buildings in it. So we're ready to create a particle system now. So we need to click here, make sure that we've got the ground selected, and just say new. We're going to create a hair particle system, and you can see we instantly get hairs appear on here. And to start with, we'll just do 100 particles. We don't need lots of segments because these are not really hairs, so we'll just go down to the minimum, which is 2, but then we'll select advanced. Come down to render and say render as a collection, and we'll turn the randomness for the scale up a little bit. We'll go to about 50%, somewhere around there. We do want show emitter selected, otherwise the ground will disappear. And then the collection, we need to select our buildings collection. Now you see they've all appeared. Make sure you select object rotation and pick random. But as usual, everything's appeared on its side. Normal with particle systems. Certainly was in earlier versions of Blender. So let's select all of our buildings and then press R for rotate, Y and 90. And if we go back to our landscape, you can see our buildings are now the right way up. Whether the scale is right is another matter. We probably need them a little bigger than that. And we can just turn that up over here. It's getting closer to where I think it should be. But at the moment, they're just randomly distributed. So now come down to vertex groups, click into density, and you can see we've got our group. I didn't name it, but there it is, our group there. But at the moment, it's trying to put the buildings where the road is. So we need to reverse that and just click this little point here. And you can see in general, they're being put where the road is not. There are a few exceptions. This is a relatively simplistic way of doing it. But what we can do is change the seed, and that will just reposition the buildings. And we can select a seed that we like. So that's a lot better. And we haven't got a huge number of buildings. Now they are in some cases impinging. And again, we can play around with the seed and things like that. I'm going to play with the scale a little bit too, I think. And you see what I mean about the actual scale of the buildings not having too much bearing on where they end up. And we've got way too many of the buildings with the little spear on the top. Not going to worry too much about this. You can, as I say, you can adjust the number of them in your collection in order to affect the number of them in the ultimate scene. If we click rotation, we can actually change the phase of the building. So you can see I'm rotating them there. You don't want too much randomness on a building. They're not plants, but you can do this. So you could have buildings at a weird sort of random angle like that. But of course, buildings are not normally like that. So you might want to change the overall phase, perhaps just to stop a building swinging right out into the middle of the road, but we probably don't want to randomize it. And you certainly don't want to randomize anything else about the rotation. So we might want a few more buildings. Perhaps if we go for 250, maybe turn the size down a little bit now. And then again, have a little play with the seed. Bearing in mind that the point of this scene is that you're not really seeing the buildings completely. So if we go to our Eevee rendered view now, I'm going to turn overlays off, which means that things that are selected don't show up as selected, even though they are. And we can start to see what's going on. So you can see this is quite interesting here, but it's not quite the effect we're looking for. And that's due to the brightness and so on of the lights. But it gives you a general idea of how things work. So one of the things I did was I selected my ground plane, and I often do this. Go to materials. I bring my overlay back on. Select the ground, go to materials, and I'm going to add another material, which is my city lights material. In other words, the light that you can see on the side of the buildings. It's not going to be visible on the ground, but it makes it an easy way to find that material and adjust it without having to go and look at my collection of buildings off to the side here. So if I now go to shading and perhaps look at these buildings over here in the light, I mean, that's an interesting effect in itself, but perhaps not what we're looking for. We can have a look at what's going on down here. So if I play around with the specular, see that affects it a little bit. Roughness affects it a little bit, but the main issue is the base color here. So we turn this down, perhaps all the way to black. That's getting much better now. And we can then play with the specular. Normally you don't play around with the specular size, but in this case I'm doing so just to sort of soften that reflection quite a bit. So now they are reflecting light, but it's a lot less significant. And this is one of the advantages of Eevee. I'm now in Eevee shading mode, preview shading mode, and we can already start to look around at our buildings and see what effects we're getting. Those lights are much too bright and much too big, but it's giving us a general idea. So now about the lights. So if I press play, nothing's happening at the moment. There's no animation of any kind. And what I need to do now is add another material into, in this case, the ground, because that's just where it's easy to find it. And it's a material I've already created, and that's the flashing light material. Before I do anything else with it though, what I need to do is go to my buildings, specifically the building with that top. In fact, I'm going to delete one of these because there's way too many of those. So go to this building, go to the very top there. You can see we've already got one face selected there. So I'm just going to Control plus, just select a few more faces, and I'm going to apply or assign the flashing light material to that. So you can see it's gone red, so we know that's it. But I'd like to see what it's doing over here, back into Eevee mode. And I'm just going to go to the particle system and just change the seed again. You can see we've got somewhat less of those now, of those pointy buildings, but we've still got a fair few. It obviously likes that shape. And if we turn the overlays off, but make sure we've got the ground selected, we can see our flashing light material there. and we can go to shading mode again. So I'm going to remove this time the principled shader and just add initially an emission shader. Connect that into the surface and you can see we've got something lit up just there. And let's change this to a bright red. And perhaps make it a level 2. So that's straightforward. We've just got a light, a red light. But obviously what I want is for this to flash. So I'm going to open, and this is slightly trickier in Blender 2.8, open a new window. And I'm going to set this one to the timeline. Don't strictly need this up to be able to advance the timeline, but it is helpful. So pressing play, nothing happens at the moment. I'm going to assume we've only got 1 or 2 buildings in our scene that we're going to see at least that have this flashing light on. So all I'm going to do now, with it set to the strength that for the moment I want it to have, and with the timeline at the beginning, I'm going to stick with the default of 250 frames at the moment. I'm just going to press I over the strength. And now I've opened up a graph editor. Make sure this node is selected. If we open this up, you can see we've got strength visible there because that's now keyframed. And we've got a couple of little dope sheet points down here. So if I press N, that brings up a menu on the right hand side here. And we need to select modifiers. Select add modifier and select built-in function because we want this to be a regular flash. So you can see we get a nice sine wave. If I press play, you can see our little red light is flashing very nicely there, but it's not really quite what we're looking for. So I used an amplitude of 4. You can see it's now bigger. It's going from -4 to +4. The minus numbers don't really have any relevance to an emission shader. I used a phase multiplier, which is basically the speed 0.3. And then what we need to do is an offset so that we use the full range. We just lift it up like that so that it's basically going to black and then up to full strength. But it's sort of fading up and down at the moment, which you might want, but I wanted it to sort of clip a little bit on that. I'll just minimize that one. I then added another modifier called limits. Select minimum Y and maximum Y. Minimum Y I left at 0. Maximum Y I set to 3. And we can then play around with things like the offset to get the sort of shape we want. So if we take it to there, it's mostly off, and if we push it up to the other way, it's mostly on with a short flash off, and obviously halfway between the two, which is roughly where I had it, it's roughly equal mark space with just as long on as it was off, and very little time spent going from off to on. So that's a nice flashing light. In theory, you can then just create copies of this material and modify the values in here, such as putting a phase offset on, which will make the light flash at a slightly different rate. There may be a slight bug in Blender 2.8, or at least the version that I downloaded around mid-February. So I ended up doing a sort of workaround of using a value input and using 4 different value inputs to control the strength of this and then modifying the value input. But if you only want 1 or 2 lights, it doesn't really matter if they all flash together because you're not going to see all of them at the same time. I had quite a lot in my scene. So that's how you can create a flashing light. And you can see they're all flashing together, but I've got rather a lot of them. So now what we need to do is add some volumetrics. So I'll just stop that flashing for the moment. I haven't played around with the lights yet because they're going to get a bit dimmer when we add the volumetrics. So we'll turn overlays back on. We'll place our 3D cursor just there, just so we know where things are going to appear. And I'll simply add a cube. You notice at the moment that cube is appearing in here. And that's because we had our buildings collection selected. So that's an easy way to just add something new. However, I don't want it in that collection, so I'm going to press M and move it to the main collection. Now you can see it's disappeared from there. Quite an interesting little effect. So I'm moving that over on top of our ground, scale, Shift Z, so scaling all the axes except for Z. And let's have a look from the side. We'll scale on the Z now, make it a little bigger there. And then GZ. And perhaps, I think I'm going to scale it down quite a bit on the Z there as well. And I'm just moving it around. I don't really want a lot more fog than I'm actually going to see, so I'll just have it to just below the ground. Go into edit mode with face select on and GZ just so I can work out just above the lamps there. So we'll go to object settings and we'll just call this fog. Then we'll go to the material and say new. We'll go to shader settings You can see it just about make it out there. I need to close that additional window there. And we'll remove the principal BSDF. We don't need that. I'm going to add a shader, which is a volumetric scattering node, volume scatter. And we'll get a bit more advanced with this in a moment. But this needs to go not into the surface, but into the volume input. So if we have a look at what's going on now, initially nothing's happening, even though we're looking at this with Eevee shader on. And that's because we haven't got, if I take that out of there, you can see it goes black. It's just basically going invisible. And that's because we aren't telling Eevee to render volumetrics at the moment. So we now need to come to our render settings, just above the output settings, which is the sort of printer icon. And we need to look at what we're rendering. And you can see volumetrics is not selected. So I'll select that now. And you can see suddenly that all changes down here. And you can even see there's volumetric shadows or God rays being generated. So that's already quite interesting. But it's a little on the thick side, even allowing for the fact those lights are very bright. So if I open up volumetric, what you also may need to do is increase the end distance of the volumetric effect. Because you can see as I bring the camera away, it suddenly disappears. And on a big scene like this, you may need to have that a lot more. So I'm going to set that to 1000 meters. So that seems to be all right now, but obviously slowed it down quite a bit. Bear in mind, this is a preview version. I found volumetric shadows slowed things down quite a bit, so I left that as it was. I also decreased the tile size, which basically increases the resolution of the volumetrics, but don't go too mad because it will slow things down and can even crash it. So you can see that's slightly finer now. And I also increased the samples to 128. So that starts to give me a finer volumetric effect. I also turned on bloom while we're at it, though you'll also need to change the values on there because they're a bit extreme to begin with. So I turned radius down to about 2. You can see that made it a lot smaller. And the intensity down to about 0.5. You can play around with it depending on the size of your scene. But obviously you don't want too much bloom, but a little bit adds to it. So you can see those windows are sort of glowing slightly now. So back to our volumetric material. Fog is rarely a simple blanket unless it's completely opaque. So I'm going to add a few more nodes now, and the first one I'm going to add is a texture coordinate node. So under input, let's have the texture coordinate node. And now I'll add a separate X, Y, and Z node. So under converter, separate X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to put the generated output of the texture coordinate into there. And I'm going to use the Z output. So I'm going to add a color ramp under converters, as always. Take the Z output and put that into the input of the color ramp. For the time being, I'm just going to put the color output of the color ramp into the density of our fog. I'm going to bring black end up here. And you can see what that's doing is actually making the lower down fog invisible. If I bring the white end down, that doesn't seem to do a lot. If I swap these over and take the right hand end down, you can see our fog starts to drop. So what this is doing is it's saying if the fog's higher than a certain amount, fade it out. So we could have a more gentle fade out with B-spline, for example. So rather than a fog just stopping suddenly where the top of the geometry for our fog object is, we can fade it as it gets higher. So that's a start. That sort of makes it a little more natural looking. You can see even the lights are looking better now. In fact, they glow within the fog. But I wanted to also have some variation in the fog as well. So I'll add another node, which is a texture node and simple noise texture. I'll reference it to texture coordinates because I want it to be 3D noise, not just flat noise. I'll add another color ramp, flip that back. I'll put the output of the noise into the input of the color ramp. I'll set this to the values I use, but of course with all these sorts of things, you often have to tweak them depending on the overall scale. And I didn't make any measurements, so the scale of this scene might be slightly different to the one I created originally. So we'll set the noise scale to 110 and the detail up to 16. Because this is a sort of swirly mist, I'm going to add some distortion, and we'll add a distortion of 1.7. Now I need to combine that with the height fading nodes. I'm now going to add a color mix node and drop that in there, but I'm going to change it to subtract. I'm going to put the output of this color ramp into the other side, and I'm going to set the factor to about 0.2 and then drag this pointer down a little bit. In fact, if I just take this straight over to density, we may be able to see what's happening. Possibly the noise frequency is a little high. So we'll take this down a little bit. So you can see that's just sort of adding some variation into it. Maybe you can go lower than that and perhaps go to ease. So you can see we've got some variation in the noise there. And we can combine that with the other side to give us our combined varying noise. So you can see there, we've now got the sort of little puffs of clouds. Now, if you want to, you can animate that. What you need to do is to put a vector mapping node in here and just animate one of the parameters. So if I, for example, showed you, here's the vector mapping node, you just put that in between there, and then just animate, for example, X location very slowly, and you'll get some variation of the noise. And it won't just move, but it will actually change as it moves, because that's the nature of three-dimensional noise. I didn't worry too much about that because it's not that visible. So that's created our fog and our flashing lights, and all that's really left now is to animate the camera. So to do that, I'm going to come out of that mode, and the first thing I'm going to do is just add a curve. So I'll add a path, and there it is. I'll scale it up a bit so it's easier to see. We go to wireframe mode, it's even more easy to see. And I'll just rotate it and get it here somewhere to begin with. And you notice it's appeared inside our buildings again. I really must select a different collection for that. Select M for move, and I'll just move it over to main, and now there's only one of them. Select the N vertex there, and then just start moving and then extruding them. I want to make sure that I'm ultimately traveling where there are no buildings. So obviously way above the city at the moment, but that's fine. At the moment I'm just doing this sort of 2D movement of the flight, and you notice it adds a nice Bezier curve to it anyway. So we'll stop the flight there, but we need to obviously make this a little bit more three-dimensional. So now looking from the side, we can select several vertices here and perhaps move those down, or points on the curve really, not vertices. Perhaps select that one and that one, move those up, and I'll leave that there, but that's basically gives you the idea. Perhaps we're coming down from our flight up here. You don't want any too rapid changes in direction, because what I did was already quite a bit of movement. That's our curve, our NURBS path as it happens. Now we need to find our camera. So that's in collection 2, I happen to know, and you notice it's invisible at the moment, so I just made it visible, and there is our camera. Just going to scale it up a bit so we can see it, and I'm going to put it here. Control A, apply rotation and scale. Select my curve, Control A, apply rotation and scale, and then select the camera. And although there is a quicker way to do this, there are some issues with doing it that way. So I'm just going to go to camera constraints, add an object constraint, which is a follow path. Select the NURBS path, click animate path, and this isn't going to be quite right to start with. You can see our camera's there. So it just needs to be moved up to join the curve, at least roughly. And just going to call up a timeline, and you can see there goes the camera. And it then just stops when it gets to about frame 100, funnily enough. So if I select my curve, select curve properties, under path animation, you can see it's only animating over 100 frames, and my animation is 250 frames long. So let's set this to 250 and see what that looks like. And you can see that's fine, except my camera is always pointing in one direction, which I probably don't want. You might, but for my purposes, I wanted it to follow the curve. So I go to my object constraints, and if we say follow curve, now the camera is following the curve. And let's look through the view of the camera. If there are a few issues, I'll now switch to Eevee view, and you can see we are flying through our city. And given this is real-time rendering, I think that's quite fun. It's a little fast, probably want to do this at half the speed. I could even slow it down here by actually utilizing less of the curve. So if I select the curve, go to curve properties, I could say render it over 500 frames, so it won't actually get to the end. And then press play. You can see we're traveling a little more slowly. And that's basically all there is to it. You can render this in the normal way. The good thing is, As you can see, the rate that this is rendering, it won't take very long to render at all. If I just rendered this one image, I'll actually go back a little bit just so we've got something a bit more interesting to see. Still need to right click to move the pointer in the timeline. So I'll press F12 there. And that took 3.5 seconds to produce this scene. Now, obviously it's very simple, but I think that's not a bad render. I also use one of the techniques I've used multiple times to create a sort of night sky scene where I put stars in it, but I've got lots of videos on how to do that. Essentially, it's just a noise texture filtered through a color ramp. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, let me know, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well. And I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.